Hi, I'm Anna Frizzetto here with Michael Colbrenner, and welcome. Today, we're diving into how today's complex C suite can either fuel your revenue or slow you down. So let's talk about it. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Anna, thank you so much for doing this today. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, so we're looking forward. We're going to do a six-part series in regards to this subject. But the first topic is really talking a little bit about how modern leadership structures can either fuel or kill your growth. So let's start with, the difference. Like, well, what do we mean when we say modern leadership? There's the old C-suite where you have like the traditional CEO, COO, CFO, versus new C-suite, which is your CRO, CTO, CMO, CSO. Right? You have a variety. So, what are we seeing are some of the complexities between the old and the new?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. We're all very willing to talk about matrix organizations. And what you described is one of those things that generate the matrix. And while it's the right idea for sure, and the leadership that you described in sort of the modern C suite is right on, it does require a different level of communication and transparency in leadership to ensure that all of the teams have a clear understanding of what the expectations are. And you and I have talked about this in the past. The other challenge can be who is the person responsible for dictating the strategy and the plan if that's not been clearly communicated. And how do you do that?
Right, and I think often what we've talked about is how you can see when you have, like, peer level between, like, a chief marketing officer, a chief sales officer, or a chief revenue officer, that sometimes if there isn't the right level of coordination, it has mixed messaging, which then affects the overall, sales strategy, go-to-market strategy. It really affects the growth of the company.
Yeah, and the people in the roles also impact how we think about it. I worked someplace that had a chief digital officer, and that person was seen as responsible for the marketing strategy for the whole company. And when I first realized that, it was a little bit of a surprise that that person was seen as the authority on a range of things and really had the responsibility for determining what we were all working on. Um, and I wouldn't have thought that about a chief digital officer. It was more about the person in the role than necessarily the title. And so how do you communicate organizationally how to take, especially in roles where I'm in an engineering role and I'm trying to build features, who do I listen to? How do I know that the requests I'm being asked to do are aligned with the right strategy? And I've been on those calls where let's say a CSO and a CMO are not on, let's say, especially on timing. What is the thing that's most pressing for us to work on right now? That has to be clearly communicated and advocated by the C suite in a way that we all understand. And, one of the things that you and I talk about is like, what is the frequency that the C suite is connecting? And is there somebody in the room, and hopefully it's the CEO, who is playing the leadership role to say, hey, I've heard everything. I see there are some disagreements and maybe what our approach is. This is what we're going to do. And I think that a lot of companies don't realize the importance of clarity from the top and are hopeful that they'll get what they're hoping for, you know, in a distributed matrix environment. And, hope is not a plan.
Right, it's interesting, you kinda hit the nail on the head when you said, having kind of like that unified, reporting structure and who do you listen to? From my perspective, and I'm probably biased, being having been a CRO for, many years, but it's where you have, your, sales and marketing reported into one individual, right? So that it kinda carries the overall marketing and sales strategy as far as what you're selling, how you're positioning it, and so on and so forth. But then your CIO is reporting into the same individual. So like that, there's unity in the story, in the message, right? So for example, if I as the CRO and you as the CIO are reporting into the CEO, then we have that common ground that we can kind of come together and the CEO can kind of drive the mission and the vision. Where it kind of falls apart is where you see sometimes, a CIO might be reporting into a COO or a CFO, and a CRO might be reporting maybe to a COO, right? Not directly to the CEO. And then you start having like these multiple layers within the C suite that cause that level of confusion.
And I think you're right, almost definitionally, the CRO should be the top role for CMO, CSO, PR, whatever, all reporting into. People forget sometimes that we're always talking about revenue. If we're not always talking about revenue, then we're making a mistake. And that's at all levels. We all need to be on the same page when we talk about revenue. And I think strategically speaking, you need a person who is saying, look, in order for us to get where we're going, this is what all the jobs are. One of the fun things in social media now is there are a lot of videos about the difference between the roles, right? Because nobody other than people who are like close to that area of the business, what is the difference between marketing? What is the difference between sales and business development and PR? How do all of these things interconnect? And I think companies that don't have a person who is responsible for communicating the strategy for those roles, and frequently it is the CEO, in very sales minded organizations, I think you can count on a CEO for that. But from a day to day perspective, that's probably not enough unless you have this really great partnership between the revenue aligned leadership. And I think that, with the incredible movement and volatility, let's say, in technology, how do you create a message that you're going to say, well, this is our message for 2025? I was just working with a company and they shared with me a diagram that represented their business in 2024. And it looked a little like a workflow diagram. It sort of had each division of their business separate. So engineering, cloud, data, security. And they updated the diagram to be more of a circle. How did they change the communication internally, right? They had this one way of viewing their business to really a more integrated view of their business, right? But there is a goal with that change in that diagram. What is the goal they're trying to convey? Don't just sort of say, oh, well, we changed the diagram. Well, the goal is to demonstrate that this business has the ability to holistically provide consulting services for their customers, not siloed consulting for their customers, right? And so it's like a little tiny change, what appears to be a tiny change. But when we get in the room and we're selling the product offering, how are we communicating it? In the past, we were saying, would you like to meet our data consultants? And today we're saying, can we look at your whole infrastructure and see what the opportunities are? And the messaging has to be well communicated. Otherwise, when we're selling in the room, we all don't know exactly what we're talking about.
Right, right. And I think you also kind of touch on the fact of by having this unified reporting structure, you actually see pipeline conversion, right? Increase. I mean, I look at it, from the sales perspective, and that's the biggest indicator. I think when you and I were talking about different examples, and there was like a real life, client story, just by restructuring their reporting structure within their organization, that it actually caused a positive impact on their pipeline improvement, where they were able to get more deals in the pipeline and also convert to closure more deals. So that's the key. It's how you're. I mean, it all starts with how you're organized right from the get go.
Yeah. And I mean, when you're talking about, especially let's say a software product or anything, it really not just a software product, but an offering that a company is making, how do you make sure that the feature set that's being delivered meets the needs of this organizational matrix? Right. And so there's a lot of impact. I could have a team of engineers working on a feature that we thought was a priority, and market conditions change, and that has to change. And when we make that change, we should over communicate to the teams. Hey, we know you've been working on this feature. Yes, it was valued and important, but look at these economic conditions that have changed. As a result, we're going to pivot, and we're not going to work on this feature that you were working on, and we're going to pivot to something else. Like, it's easy communication. It's just good discipline about how you communicate. And I think what people sometimes don't realize is that communication is a discipline. And people like structure, especially in engineering. We want you to tell us the boundaries. Tell us exactly what you want us to work on. In organizations, and Agile gets this a little bit wrong. They're like, well, innovate your way to the right spot. Okay, yes, and what do we need to work on to create revenue? Let's start there, and then let's innovate together. But I just think that frequently, from the meeting that happens to set the strategy to the time, let's say if I'm head of engineering, not CTO, not CIO, but just I run engineering teams, like that could only be two levels. And in two levels, we could lose the communication.
Exactly. So I think the key takeaway here with our first video short is, structure either empowers or hinders alignment and revenue. So therefore, you got to get the structure right, and your strategy will definitely follow. A call to action to the listeners: if your org structure feels more like chaos than collaboration, drop a line in the comments, and we would love to start the conversation and figure out how can we talk about realignment.